Welcome to Echoes of History. Before we begin this epic journey into the past, make sure to subscribe, so you never miss the stories of empires, leaders, and civilizations that shaped our world. In the beginning, Rome was nothing more than a collection of huts perched on 7 hills beside the Tiber River. Its people were farmers and shepherds, bound together by hardship and survival. Yet from this humble origin would rise one of the greatest powers the world had ever known. The story of Rome is not only the story of conquest and empire, it is the story of human ambition, resilience, and the endless struggle between freedom and power. Legends tell us Rome was born in blood and destiny. Twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants, were suckled by a she-wolf and grew to become leaders of men. When the time came to found a city, a quarrel erupted. Romulus slew his brother and gave his name to the settlement, Rome. Though myth, the story reflects a truth. Rome was born from violence, and violence would forever mark its path. For centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. These monarchs, some wise, others cruel, laid the foundations of Roman society. They drained marshes, built temples, and established religious rituals that endured for generations. But tyranny bred resentment, and when the last king, Tarquin the Proud, ruled with arrogance and fear, the people rose in rebellion. They cast him out, swore never again to bow to a king, and founded a republic. The Roman Republic was unlike anything seen before. Power rested not in one man but in many. Each year, citizens elected 2 consuls to lead the state. Beneath them, the Senate of Elders debated policy, while assemblies of the people cast their votes. Magistrates carried out laws, and even the poorest citizen had a role to play. Rome's greatest pride was that no man could ever again seize the crown. Yet the seeds of ambition were not so easily buried. The Republic faced challenges from the start. Surrounding tribes, the Etruscans, Latins, Sabines, and Samnites, saw Rome as a rival and a threat. War after war tested the fledgling state, but Rome endured. Its strength lay in its citizens. Every free man was a soldier, bound by duty to defend his homeland. Defeat was never final, for Rome always returned to the battlefield, learning from mistakes, adapting its tactics, and pressing forward. The Roman legion was unlike any other army. Organized, disciplined, and flexible, it turned farmers into warriors and citizens into conquerors. Unlike the phalanxes of Greece, rigid and unwieldy, the legion could bend, shift, and respond. In time, the Roman way of war would dominate the known world. Rome's rise was slow, but steady. Through the Latin Wars, the Samnite Wars, and countless struggles with neighbors, Rome spread its influence across the Italian peninsula. Each victory brought new allies, new soldiers, and greater strength. By offering conquered peoples a share of citizenship and a place within the Republic, Rome bound them to its cause. This genius for inclusion, as much as the sword, built Rome's power. Yet even as Rome grew, cracks appeared within. The plebeians, the common people, demanded greater rights. They fought not with swords, but with strikes, refusing to fight in Rome's wars until reforms were granted. Slowly, painfully, the Republic opened its doors wider, creating tribunes to defend the people's interests and writing laws on tablets for all to see. It was not equality, but it was a beginning. Rome's destiny, however, lay beyond Italy. Across the sea lay Carthage, a city as wealthy and ambitious as Rome itself. Where Rome ruled the land, Carthage ruled the waves. Its ships carried goods from Spain, Africa, and the far reaches of the Mediterranean. Its coffers overflowed with silver, its harbors buzzed with trade, and its influence stretched far and wide. When Rome and Carthage's ambitions collided in Sicily, war was inevitable. Thus began the Punic Wars, a struggle that would last more than a century and decide the fate of the ancient world. The First Punic War was a trial by fire. Rome, a land power, had no navy to match Carthage's might. At first, Carthage dominated, striking from the sea with ease. But Rome adapted. Capturing a Carthaginian warship, they studied its design and built their own fleet, hundreds of ships strong. To these, they added the corvus, a boarding bridge that transformed naval battles into infantry duels. For 23 years, the war raged across Sicily and the seas. At last, Rome triumphed, seizing Sicily as its first province. But Carthage was not defeated. In Spain, the Barcid family rose to power, led by Hamilcar and later his son, Hannibal. Hannibal was a commander of unmatched brilliance, sworn from childhood to be Rome's eternal enemy. In 218 BC, he embarked on one of the most daring campaigns in history. Leading an army of men, horses, and even elephants, he crossed the Alps into Italy. The journey was brutal, but his arrival shook the Republic to its core. At Tribia, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal crushed Roman legions. Then, at Cannae, he delivered a masterpiece of strategy, surrounding and annihilating an army twice his size. Rome bled, but Rome did not yield. Refusing to negotiate, the Senate raised new armies, fortified the city, and waged a war of attrition. Hannibal wandered Italy for years, undefeated but unable to break Rome's spirit. Meanwhile, Rome struck back in Spain, cutting off Carthage's resources. A young general, Scipio, rose to prominence, seizing Carthage's strongholds and carrying the war to Africa itself. Hannibal was recalled, and at Zama in 202 BC, the two great generals met. Scipio's legions shattered Carthage's last hope, and Hannibal fled into exile. Rome had won, but the victory changed it forever. Wealth flooded into the Republic, along with slaves and land. Senators grew rich, generals grew powerful, and the balance that had once defined Rome began to falter. The Republic was stronger than ever abroad, but within, ambition and corruption festered. Rome had defeated Carthage, but in doing so, it had unleashed forces that would one day destroy the Republic itself. Rome had defeated Carthage, but in doing so, it had unleashed forces that would one day destroy the Republic itself. The spoils of war poured into the city: gold, silver, grain, slaves, and entire provinces now lay under Rome's authority. The Republic, once a modest city-state, had become the master of the Mediterranean. Yet the very triumphs that brought Rome such power also began to unravel the bonds that had held it together. The Senate, once respected as the guardian of tradition, grew corrupt with wealth. Noble families expanded their estates, seizing lands from peasants who had gone off to fight Rome's wars. Those who returned often found their farms ruined, their livelihoods destroyed. They were forced into the city, swelling the population of Rome with restless, unemployed citizens. The gulf between rich and poor widened into a chasm. Slavery, once minor, now dominated the economy. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were brought from conquered lands, working the vast estates of the aristocracy. Their labor displaced free citizens, leaving ordinary Romans without work, dependent on grain handouts from the state. What had once been a republic of citizens began to look more like a city of masters and beggars. The Senate resisted change. The aristocrats who controlled it feared reform would weaken their grip on power. But voices arose from within Rome itself, demanding justice for the common people. Among them were two brothers who would become symbols of hope and of tragedy, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BC, sought to redistribute land to the poor. He proposed limits on the amount of land one man could own, giving the excess to those who had lost everything in Rome's wars. It was a bold plan, one that threatened the Senate's wealth. At first, he tried to work within the system, but when the Senate resisted, Tiberius appealed directly to the people. The conflict grew fierce, and violence erupted. In the end, Tiberius was murdered by a mob of senators and their supporters, his body thrown into the Tiber. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius took up the cause. More radical than Tiberius, Gaius proposed new colonies for the poor, subsidized grain, and even citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies. His popularity soared, but so too did the Senate's fear. Once again, blood was the answer. A state of emergency was declared, and Gaius, hunted by his enemies, took his own life. The Gracchi were gone, but the memory of their reforms lingered, dividing Rome into bitter factions of populares, who championed the people, and optimates, who defended the elite. This division opened the door for ambitious men to use politics and the army as weapons. Chief among them was Gaius Marius, a general of humble origin who rose to power through his victories in Africa and against invading Germanic tribes. Marius reformed the Roman army, recruiting landless citizens and offering them pay, loot, and the promise of land. For the first time, soldiers owed their loyalty not to the Republic, but to the general who commanded them. It was a turning point, one that shifted the balance of power in Rome forever. Marius became a hero, but also a threat. His dominance bred rivals, most dangerous of all being Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was a patrician, a skilled commander, and as ambitious as any Roman before him. When war broke out in the east against King Mithridates of Pontus, both Marius and Sulla sought command. The Senate gave it to Sulla, but Marius schemed to have it reassigned. In outrage, Sulla did the unthinkable, he marched his army on Rome itself. The city trembled as Roman legions entered its streets, not as defenders but as conquerors. Sulla seized power, driving Marius into exile. But fate turned quickly. While Sulla campaigned in the east, Marius returned, storming Rome with his own supporters and unleashing a reign of terror against his enemies. The Republic was no longer ruled by laws, but by the swords of generals. When Sulla returned victorious, he reclaimed control and declared himself dictator. For years, he ruled with absolute power, rewriting laws, strengthening the Senate, and crushing his opponents. When he finally retired, boasting that he had restored the Republic, what he left behind was not stability, but a precedent that the Republic's constitution could be bent or broken by any man with an army and the will to use it. In the shadow of Sulla's dictatorship, new figures emerged, men whose names would echo through history. Among them was a young aristocrat with charm, ambition, and a gift for politics, Julius Caesar. Another was a wealthy nobleman, Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose fortune bought him influence. And there was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a brilliant general who basked in the glory of his conquests. Together, these men would shape the Republic's final days. Caesar, though young, proved himself quickly. His speeches swayed crowds, his generosity won allies, and his cunning made him dangerous to his rivals. Pompey, meanwhile, won victories across the Mediterranean, defeating pirates and conquering new territories. Crassus, though less beloved, used his wealth to maintain power and prestige. Their paths would converge in an alliance that would dominate Rome, the first triumvirate. Yet before this alliance was forged, Rome faced one more test of its resilience. In 73 BC, a slave named Spartacus led a revolt that shook the Republic to its core. Escaping from a gladiator school, Spartacus and his followers grew into an army of tens of thousands, defeating Roman legions sent against them. For 2 years, Italy burned as slaves fought for freedom. Though eventually crushed by Crassus, and thousands of rebels crucified along the Appian Way, the revolt revealed the deep fractures within Roman society. By the mid-1st century BC, Rome was no longer the balanced republic it had once been. It was an empire in all but name, its power resting on the ambition of generals and the shifting will of the mob. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus would soon take center stage, their alliance promising stability but sowing the seeds of civil war. The Republic had survived the Gauls, the Samnites, and Carthage. But now, its greatest enemy was itself. The stage was set for the rise of a single man who would change the destiny of Rome forever. The Republic had survived the Gauls, the Samnites, and Carthage. But now, its greatest enemy was itself. The stage was set for the rise of a single man who would change the destiny of Rome forever. Julius Caesar was born into an old but declining patrician family. His name carried weight, but not wealth. From a young age, he displayed a fierce ambition, a hunger for power, and an instinct for survival. He married strategically, spoke with brilliance, and knew how to win the favor of Rome's restless crowds. When Sulla's dictatorship threatened his life, Caesar fled into obscurity, only to return stronger, building allies, and proving himself as both soldier and politician. Rome in Caesar's time was no longer the republic of old. Wealth from conquered provinces flowed into the city, but so too did corruption and greed. Senators feuded, mobs rioted, and generals commanded armies more loyal to them than to the state. Amid this turmoil, Caesar found opportunity. He first made his mark in Spain, serving as governor, where he crushed rebellious tribes and enriched himself with spoils. But his true genius was political. In Rome, he courted the masses with games, feasts, and speeches that stirred their hearts. He understood something the Senate often forgot: power lay not only in tradition or law, but in the will of the people. At the same time, Pompey the Great stood as Rome's most celebrated general. His victories against Mithridates in the east, his conquest of Syria and Judea, and his defeat of pirates across the Mediterranean made him a hero. Yet the Senate, jealous of his fame, delayed the approval of his settlements and denied land for his veterans. Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, resented Pompey's glory but sought his own through political deals and risky ventures. It was Caesar who saw the solution. If Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar united, they could dominate Rome, bypass the Senate, and achieve their ambitions together. Thus was formed the first triumvirate, an alliance not written in law, but bound by mutual interest. Pompey would gain land for his soldiers, Crassus would secure financial rewards, and Caesar would receive the consulship, the highest office of the Republic. In 59 BC, Caesar became consul. Though opposed by the Senate, he pushed through laws favoring both Pompey and Crassus, and in return secured his own command in Gaul. With this, his true rise began. Gaul was a vast land of tribes and warriors beyond the Alps. It was dangerous, wild, and rich with opportunity. For nearly a decade, Caesar waged war there, facing fierce resistance but always emerging victorious. He subdued tribe after tribe, crossing rivers and mountains, besieging cities, and even reaching the shores of Britain. His campaigns were brutal, hundreds of thousands died or were enslaved, but they brought him immense power. His soldiers adored him, his enemies feared him, and his victories filled Rome with awe. While Caesar conquered Gaul, Pompey remained in Rome, growing uneasy. His partnership with Caesar had once been strong, sealed by Caesar's daughter Julia, who was Pompey's wife. But when Julia died in childbirth, the bond between the two men weakened. Crassus, seeking his own glory, led an ill-fated campaign against the Parthians in the east. At Carrhae, his army was destroyed, and he was killed, leaving only Caesar and Pompey. Without Crassus, the alliance collapsed. The Senate, wary of Caesar's growing power, turned to Pompey as their champion. They ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To comply would mean trial, disgrace, perhaps even death. To resist meant civil war. Caesar chose war. In 49 BC, standing at the banks of the Rubicon River, he faced the fateful decision. To cross with his army was to defy the Senate, to declare himself an enemy of the state. But Caesar did not hesitate. Legend tells us he spoke the words, "The die is cast," and marched his legions across. Panic swept Rome. Senators fled, Pompey withdrew to the east, and Caesar entered the city unopposed. But the struggle was far from over. The Republic now split into two camps, Caesar and his populares, Pompey and the Senate's optimates. The civil war raged across the Mediterranean. At first, Pompey seemed to hold the advantage. His armies were larger, his fleets controlled the sea, and the Senate declared him the defender of the Republic. Caesar, however, moved with speed and brilliance. He pursued Pompey to Greece, where at Pharsalus in 48 BC, the two forces clashed. Though outnumbered, Caesar's veterans fought with discipline, crushing Pompey's larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge, but there met betrayal and death. His head was presented to Caesar as a gift, but Caesar wept, mourning his old ally and rival. With Pompey gone, Caesar's power was unrivaled. He traveled to Egypt, where he became entangled in the struggle between Cleopatra and her brother for the throne. Supporting Cleopatra, Caesar helped her secure power, and their alliance produced not only political gain but also a child. From Egypt, Caesar marched to Asia Minor, where he defeated King Pharnaces with stunning speed, declaring his victory in the famous words, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Returning to Rome, Caesar was appointed dictator. Yet he did not rule as Sulla had, through terror. Instead, he sought to reform. He relieved debts, restructured the calendar into the Julian system, extended citizenship, and planned colonies for Rome's veterans. He envisioned a Rome not bound by the narrow republic, but an empire unified under his guidance. But ambition is a dangerous thing. To many senators, Caesar was no reformer, but a tyrant in waiting. His honors multiplied, statues, titles, even the right to wear purple, the color of kings. Whispers spread that he sought to crown himself. For men raised in the tradition of the Republic, this was intolerable. And so, a conspiracy formed. Senators, even some of Caesar's allies, decided that the Republic could only be saved by his death. Among them was Brutus, a man Caesar trusted, whose betrayal would become immortal. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate chamber. Surrounded by conspirators, he was struck down with knives, stabbed again and again until he fell, bleeding at the foot of Pompey's statue. The man who had conquered Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon, who had dreamed of empire, was gone. But with his death, the Republic was not saved. Instead, Rome was plunged into chaos. Caesar's assassination unleashed yet another storm of civil wars, this time even bloodier than before. For though the man was gone, his legacy lived on, and those who followed would finish what he had begun. Caesar had fallen beneath the blades of men who called themselves the saviors of the Republic. But Rome did not celebrate his death. The city trembled with fear and confusion. The Senate believed it had restored liberty, yet the people mourned their champion. In the Forum, Caesar's body was carried to rest, and the crowd gathered to hear his will read aloud. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted ally and consul at the time, stood before them. At first, he spoke with restraint, calling for peace, urging the crowd not to seek vengeance. But as he held up Caesar's blood-stained cloak, showing the rents where daggers had pierced it, and as he revealed that Caesar had left his wealth and gardens to the Roman people, grief turned to fury. The citizens of Rome rioted, chasing the conspirators from the city. Liberty had not been restored. Instead, chaos had begun. The conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and the others, fled east, gathering armies to defend their cause. Meanwhile, a new figure emerged in Rome, one who would alter the course of history. His name was Gaius Octavius, known to the world as Octavian. He was only 19, Caesar's adopted son and heir. At first, few took him seriously. He was young, inexperienced, and unknown in politics. But Octavian possessed a cold determination and a patient cunning that would prove more dangerous than the fire of generals or the eloquence of senators. In the months that followed, Rome fell under the uneasy balance of three men: Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend; Octavian, Caesar's heir; and Marcus Lepidus, another ally with military power. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, dividing control of the Roman world among themselves. Their first task was vengeance. Lists of enemies were drawn up, the proscriptions, and thousands were executed. Senators and equestrians who had supported Caesar's killers were hunted down, their lands seized, their families destroyed. The blood of Rome's elite flowed, and the republic that Brutus had tried to save sank deeper into ruin. The triumvirs marched east to face the assassins. At Philippi in 42 BC, the armies of Brutus and Cassius clashed with those of Antony and Octavian. The battles were fierce, but in the end, the cause of the republic perished with its champions. Brutus fell upon his own sword, Cassius did the same, and the dream of restoring the old order died with them. The world now belonged to the heirs of Caesar. Yet unity among the victors could not last. Lepidus was soon pushed aside, leaving Antony and Octavian as rivals. Antony, older and more seasoned, controlled the east. Octavian, still in his 20s, commanded the west. For a time, they maintained peace, even sealing it with marriage. Antony wed Octavian's sister, Octavia. But Antony's heart was drawn elsewhere, to the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Cleopatra had already known Caesar, and now she found in Antony both a lover and a partner in ambition. Together, they dreamed of a new empire, one ruled from Alexandria, not Rome. Antony showered her with lands and titles, recognizing their children as heirs. To the Romans, it seemed he had betrayed his country, seduced by the wealth and allure of the East. Octavian seized upon this. A master of propaganda, Octavian portrayed Antony as a traitor, a man who had abandoned Rome for a foreign queen. He claimed Antony sought to make Cleopatra ruler of the Roman world, reducing Rome to a province of Egypt. The Senate and the people were outraged, and war was declared, not against Antony, but against Cleopatra herself. In 31 BC, the fate of the world was decided at the Battle of Actium, off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The clash was fierce, but in the heat of battle, Cleopatra's ships turned and fled. Antony, torn between duty and love, followed her, abandoning his men. The remaining fleet surrendered, and with that, the war was lost. The next year, Octavian pursued them to Egypt. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra made their final stand. Defeated and desperate, Antony fell upon his sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded as a captive in Rome, chose her own end, legend says by the bite of an asp, a serpent sacred to the gods of Egypt. With their deaths, the last resistance to Octavian vanished. Rome was his. At just 32 years old, Octavian stood as the sole master of the Roman world. But though he held absolute power, he was careful never to call himself king. The Romans hated monarchy, and Caesar's fate was a reminder of how dangerous the title could be. Instead, Octavian styled himself as Princeps, the first citizen, and claimed only to restore the Republic. In truth, he had ended it. In 27 BC, the Senate bestowed upon him the title Augustus, meaning, the revered one. He became Rome's first emperor, cloaking autocracy in the language of tradition. Under Augustus, the Republic was no more, though its name lived on. The age of the empire had begun. Augustus ruled for decades, bringing stability to a land long torn by war. He reformed the government, professionalized the army, secured the frontiers, and launched great building projects that transformed Rome into a city of marble. The economy flourished, trade expanded, and the Mediterranean entered a period of relative peace known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For many, it was a golden age. But this peace came at a cost. Freedom of speech dwindled, political opposition vanished, and the Senate became little more than a ceremonial body. Rome had exchanged liberty for stability, the Republic for an empire. And yet, for centuries to come, the world would look upon Augustus's reign as the pinnacle of Roman greatness. Statues of his youthful face stood across the empire, his image stamped on coins, his name remembered as the man who transformed Rome from a fractured republic into a mighty empire that would dominate history. But empires, like men, are mortal. Though Augustus had built a foundation strong enough to endure beyond his lifetime, the seeds of future struggles were already sown. Power would now pass not through elections or senatorial debate, but through dynasties, intrigue, and the ambitions of emperors yet to come. Rome had found its master, but in doing so, it had set itself on a path of glory and peril, a path that would one day lead to both triumphs beyond imagination and disasters that would bring the empire to its knees. Augustus had secured peace for Rome, but peace built on one man's genius and authority was fragile. The empire he forged now needed successors who could carry his vision forward. Yet, succession in a world without kings was uncertain. Rome had rejected monarchy, but it had embraced power more absolute than any kings. The question was no longer whether Rome would be ruled by emperors, but whether those emperors would prove worthy of the crown they did not dare to name. Augustus ruled for more than 40 years. In that time, he outlived many of his chosen heirs. His friend and general Agrippa, his nephews Marcellus, Gaius, and Lucius, all died before him. At last, the mantle fell upon Tiberius, his stepson, a man reluctant to rule yet skilled in command. When Augustus died in 14 AD, the Senate declared him a god, and Tiberius inherited the empire. Tiberius was no ordinary ruler. Cold, withdrawn, and deeply suspicious, he lacked his stepfather's charm and vision. But he was disciplined, cautious, and a capable administrator. Under his rule, the empire remained stable, its borders defended, its treasury secure. Yet Tiberius never trusted the Senate, nor the people. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. In his later years, disgusted with politics, he withdrew from Rome altogether, living in seclusion on the island of Capri. From there, he ruled through letters and agents, leaving the capital in the grip of fear and intrigue. When Tiberius died, Rome celebrated his passing, for his reign had ended in suspicion and terror. The throne passed to his grandnephew, Gaius, known to history as Caligula. At first, the young emperor was adored. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, the son of the beloved general Germanicus, and the people hoped he would restore the spirit of his ancestors. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the empire had found new life. But soon, Caligula revealed a darker nature. His reign descended into madness. He squandered the treasury on lavish games and palaces, demanded to be worshipped as a living god, and humiliated senators with cruel displays. Ancient sources tell tales of grotesque excess, of feasts that drained the empire's wealth, of whims that condemned nobles to death, even of plans to make his horse a consul. Whether myth or truth, what remains clear is that Caligula ruled not with reason, but with terror. After only 4 years, his own guards struck him down in a palace conspiracy, plunging Rome once again into chaos. In the aftermath, power passed to Claudius, uncle of Caligula. Claudius had been overlooked for much of his life, mocked for his stammer and limp, thought unfit for rule. Yet when placed upon the throne, he proved surprisingly capable. He expanded the empire into new lands, most famously conquering Britain, bringing Roman legions to its shores for the first time. He reformed the administration, improved the empire's infrastructure, and displayed a diligence that earned respect. But Claudius was also vulnerable, swayed by his wives and freedmen, entangled in palace intrigues that would ultimately lead to his downfall. His final wife, Agrippina the Younger, was ambitious beyond measure. She maneuvered her son from a previous marriage, Nero, into position as heir. When Claudius died, some whispered poisoned by Agrippina's hand, Nero, still a teenager, became emperor. At first, Nero's reign showed promise. Guided by wise advisors like Seneca, he presented himself as a benefactor to the people. But youth, power, and unchecked desire soon consumed him. Nero fancied himself not as a ruler, but as an artist, a singer, actor, and charioteer. He performed on stage, shocking the Roman elite, and lavished fortunes on his passions while the empire strained under his extravagance. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which consumed much of the city. Rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the flames to clear space for his grand palace, though others believed it was merely misfortune. To deflect blame, Nero turned suspicion upon a small, despised sect, the Christians. Persecution followed, brutal and merciless, with executions in the arenas and on the crosses. As Nero's reign dragged on, his cruelty deepened. He ordered the death of his own mother Agrippina, once his greatest protector. He executed rivals and silenced critics. Even the Senate, long accustomed to submission, could bear no more. Rebellions erupted across the provinces, and generals declared their defiance. In 68 AD, abandoned by allies and condemned by the Senate, Nero fled the city. Alone and despairing, he took his own life, crying out, "What an artist dies in me!" With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended, and Rome was thrown into turmoil. For the first time, the empire faced the reality of rule without a clear heir. In a single year, 4 men would claim the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Civil war shook the empire, as legions marched against each other, cities burned, and the illusion of stability cracked. Yet out of this chaos emerged a new dynasty, one that would restore order and carry Rome into a new age, the Flavians. The reigns of the Julio-Claudian emperors had revealed both the strength and the fragility of Rome's imperial system. Augustus had laid a foundation that could endure, but the character of the emperor shaped the destiny of millions. A cautious ruler like Tiberius brought security, a madman like Caligula brought terror, an administrator like Claudius expanded horizons, an artist like Nero brought ruin. Rome had become an empire of men rather than laws, and its fate now depended on the virtues, or vices, of those who wore the purple. Yet despite madness, cruelty, and bloodshed, the empire endured. The legions still guarded the frontiers, the roads still carried trade, the aqueducts still brought water to the cities. Rome's strength was greater than any one man, and though emperors rose and fell, the empire pressed forward, adapting, surviving, and preparing for the trials yet to come. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had ended in flames, but Rome was not finished. Out of the ashes of Nero's reign would rise new leaders, new victories, and new challenges. The story of the empire was only beginning, and its echoes would thunder across the centuries. Nero's death had left the empire shaken, yet Rome endured. Emperors came and went, soldiers proclaimed new rulers, civil wars erupted, and dynasties rose from blood and ambition. But amid the thunder of battles and the schemes of politics, something else was stirring quietly in the corners of the empire, something that would shape the future more profoundly than any emperor's decree. In the dusty provinces of Judea, far from the marble palaces of Rome, a new faith had been born. It began with a teacher named Jesus of Nazareth, who spoke of love, forgiveness, and a kingdom not of this world. He gathered followers, healed the sick, and preached to the poor. To the Roman authorities and local leaders, he seemed a threat, a man whose words stirred unrest in a land already difficult to govern. Around the year 30 AD, he was condemned to die by crucifixion, the punishment reserved for rebels and slaves. His followers claimed he had risen from the dead, and from this belief grew a movement that spread slowly but steadily across the empire. At first, the Romans paid little attention. Christianity was seen as just another sect within Judaism, one of many strange cults tolerated in the vast empire. But unlike other religions, it spread not through temples or rituals of state, but through ordinary men and women, slaves and merchants, soldiers and widows. Its message of equality before God, of salvation for all, carried a power that appealed to the lowly and dispossessed, even as it unsettled the mighty. The apostles carried the word far beyond Judea. Paul of Tarsus, once an enemy of Christians, became their greatest missionary, traveling across Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome itself, writing letters that would one day form the backbone of the New Testament. Communities of believers grew in secret, meeting in homes and catacombs, bound together by faith and defiance. Rome, however, demanded loyalty not only to laws but to the emperor himself. Religion was not merely personal, it was civic duty. Sacrifices to the gods and to the emperor were acts of allegiance, signs that one honored the empire's order. Christians refused. They worshipped only one God and rejected the divinity of emperors. To Roman eyes, this was not piety, but treason. Persecution followed. Under Nero, after the Great Fire, Christians were scapegoated, their deaths turned into gruesome spectacles in the arenas. Some were burned alive, others torn apart by beasts, while crowds cheered. Later emperors, uncertain and inconsistent, at times tolerated them, at times punished them. Yet persecution only strengthened their resolve. Martyrs died with prayers on their lips, and their courage inspired others to join the faith. By the 2nd century, Christianity had spread across the empire. It grew not through conquest but through conviction, carried on trade routes, whispered in workshops, shared in markets. Its growth alarmed emperors like Decius and Diocletian, who unleashed some of the harshest persecutions in Rome's history. Entire communities were targeted, churches destroyed, scriptures burned. For a time, it seemed the empire might crush the movement entirely. But the more Rome struck, the stronger the faith became. The blood of martyrs became the seed of the church, and what had begun as a small sect in a distant province was transforming into a force that even emperors could not ignore. Amid this struggle, the empire itself was changing. The 2nd and 3rd centuries were marked not only by religious conflict but by political and military crises. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often slain by their own soldiers. Civil wars drained the treasury, barbarian tribes pressed at the borders, and plagues swept through cities, killing millions. The strength of Rome seemed to wane, its glory dimming under the weight of endless strife. Yet even as the empire staggered, Christianity advanced. Its bishops organized communities, its writings spread, and its hope of eternal life offered comfort in times of fear and despair. Slowly, quietly, the faith of the persecuted was preparing to outlast the empire that sought to destroy it. By the early 4th century, the empire faced a decisive moment. Civil wars once again tore Rome apart, as rival emperors fought for control. Out of this chaos emerged Constantine, a man who would change the relationship between Rome and Christianity forever. But his story, and the transformation it brought, belonged to the next chapter of the empire's saga.
The empire that Augustus had built, and that generations of emperors had expanded, was by the 3rd century staggering under its own weight. What had once been the proud master of the Mediterranean was now a colossus cracking at the seams. Its enemies pressed harder at the borders, its rulers rose and fell like shadows, and within its cities, plague, famine, and despair hollowed out the strength of Rome. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the empire nearly collapsed under the burden of its own greatness. In just 50 years, more than 20 emperors rose to the throne, most of them soldiers proclaimed by their legions. Few reigned for more than a handful of years, and many met violent ends. The purple cloak of the emperor became less a symbol of glory than a death sentence. Generals turned against each other, legions betrayed their masters, and loyalty shifted with the winds of fortune. While Rome tore itself apart, enemies struck. To the north, Germanic tribes swept across the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into Roman lands. To the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire under Shapur I humiliated Rome, capturing Emperor Valerian himself and parading him as a trophy. In the provinces, rebellion flared. The empire fractured into breakaway states, the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, leaving Rome a hollow shell of its former unity. And yet, even in this chaos, Rome refused to die. Emperors like Aurelian fought to reunite the empire, reclaiming lost provinces and restoring a measure of order. The walls of Rome were rebuilt to defend against invasion, and for a time, the city still stood as the eternal heart of the empire. But the crisis had revealed a truth that could not be ignored: the old order was failing. Rome could no longer be ruled as it had been. A new kind of leadership was needed, one that could impose stability upon the storm. That leader emerged in Diocletian. Rising from humble origins, a soldier of the provinces, Diocletian seized power in 284 AD and reshaped the empire with ruthless efficiency. He understood that no single man could control so vast a realm, so he divided it. The empire would be ruled by 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars, a system called the Tetrarchy. With this, the empire was split east and west, each with its own ruler, armies, and capitals. It was a bold experiment, meant to preserve unity through division. Diocletian also reformed the economy, imposing new taxes, reorganizing the provinces, and trying to stabilize the currency that had been debased by decades of crisis. He strengthened the military, building new forts and securing the frontiers. For a time, his measures worked. The empire found a measure of stability it had long lost. But Diocletian was also ruthless in his defense of the old gods. Seeing Christianity as a threat to imperial unity, he launched the most severe persecution yet, burning churches, imprisoning clergy, and forcing believers to renounce their faith or face death. Despite his strength, Diocletian was unique among emperors. He chose to step down. In 305 AD, weary and ill, he abdicated, retiring to a palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he spent his final years tending gardens. His tetrarchy, however, did not survive him. Within years, rivalries between emperors erupted, and civil wars once again consumed the empire. Out of this chaos rose Constantine, the son of Constantius, one of the tetrarchs. From the beginning, Constantine was marked by destiny. Tall, commanding, and shrewd, he proved himself a capable general, winning victories in Britain and Gaul. When his father died, his troops hailed him emperor, setting him on a collision course with rivals who claimed the same throne. The decisive moment came in 312 AD, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Constantine faced Maxentius, a rival emperor entrenched in the city. The night before the battle, according to legend, Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light, with the words, "In this sign, you will conquer." Taking this as a divine message, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol upon their shields. The next day, his army triumphed, and Maxentius drowned in the Tiber. Constantine entered Rome as victor, convinced that the Christian God had granted him his crown. The consequences were enormous. For centuries, Christians had been persecuted, their faith driven underground. Now, the emperor himself embraced their cause. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting tolerance to Christians and restoring their confiscated property. Churches were built openly, bishops took seats at imperial councils, and Christianity began its rise from persecuted sect to favored faith of the empire. Yet Constantine was no mere servant of religion, he was a shrewd politician. He saw in Christianity a unifying force for his empire, a single faith that could transcend provinces and peoples. By aligning himself with it, he bound his power to a divine authority stronger than any senate or tradition. At the same time, he retained the old symbols of Roman power, ensuring continuity with the past even as he shaped a new future. Constantine also changed the very geography of Rome's rule. Recognizing that the empire's strength lay in the east, closer to trade routes and threatened frontiers, he founded a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium. In 330 AD, he dedicated it as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. With its mighty walls, strategic position, and wealth, it would eclipse Rome itself, becoming the heart of the Eastern Empire for 1,000 years. When Constantine died in 337, he left behind an empire transformed. Christianity, once hunted, now stood at the center of power. The imperial capital had shifted eastward, and the old Roman world of gods and temples had begun to give way to churches and crosses. The crisis of the 3rd century had nearly destroyed the empire, but out of its fire had come rebirth. Yet with rebirth came new questions. Could the empire, now Christian, remain the same Rome that had conquered the world? Could it hold together under the weight of new faith, shifting borders, and the ambitions of emperors yet to come? The answers would echo across the next centuries, shaping not only Rome, but the very course of Western civilization. When Constantine died in 337, the empire stood transformed. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars still had temples, but the cross now shone beside the eagle of Rome. The new capital of Constantinople glittered in the east, its walls rising strong above the Bosporus, while the ancient city of Rome remained proud yet diminished, a relic of an older age. Constantine's sons divided his empire among themselves, but ambition and mistrust soon tore them into conflict. Civil war once again bathed Rome in blood, until only one son, Constantius II, remained. Under his reign and those who followed, the empire walked a delicate line between old traditions and new faith. Constantine had favored Christianity, but he had not abolished the old gods. Now, emperors leaned more heavily toward the church. Pagan temples still stood, but their glory faded. Bishops gained influence, councils debated doctrine, and the faith of the crucified Christ slowly became the soul of the empire. Yet not all accepted this change. In 361, Julian, known to history as the Apostate, tried to turn Rome back to its ancient gods. He reopened temples, restored sacrifices, and dreamed of reviving the old religion. But his reign was brief. He fell in battle against the Persians, and with his death, the chance to restore paganism died as well. The empire marched on, but its strength was not what it once had been. The sheer size of its dominion was both its glory and its curse. From the Rhine to the Euphrates, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Britain, the legions guarded frontiers that stretched beyond endurance. And at those frontiers, new threats gathered. To the east, the Persians remained a constant foe, pressing against Syria and Mesopotamia. To the north, Germanic tribes grew restless, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and countless others. No longer were they mere raiders, They were nations on the move, driven by hunger, pressure from other migrating peoples, and the lure of Rome's wealth. In 364, the empire faced a crucial moment. Valentinian, a soldier of fierce energy, became emperor. Recognizing that no man could rule both East and West effectively, he chose to divide the empire once more, not as rivals, but as partners. He ruled the West, based in Milan and later Ravenna, while his brother Valens governed the East from Constantinople. Though still united in name, Rome had become two realms, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. This division, intended as practical, would in time become permanent. For a while, the arrangement worked. The East, wealthier and more urbanized, stood strong behind the walls of Constantinople. The West, poorer and stretched thin, struggled to defend its long borders. The Goths in particular pressed hardest. In 378, disaster struck at Adrianople, where Valens met them in battle. The Roman army, once invincible, was annihilated, and Valens himself perished in the flames. It was a wound from which Rome never truly recovered. Yet fortune still favored the empire in moments. Theodosius the Great rose to power, a man of talent and determination. He restored some stability, pacified the Goths with treaties, and for a time reunited East and West under his hand. More importantly, he took the decisive step that Constantine had avoided. He made Christianity not just tolerated, but the official religion of the empire. The old pagan temples were closed, sacrifices forbidden, and the ancient gods of Rome faded into memory. The empire of Augustus and Trajan had been pagan, the empire of Theodosius was Christian. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire was once again divided between his two sons, Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east. From this moment onward, the division was final. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, would endure for 1,000 years more, later called the Byzantine Empire. The Western Empire, however, stood on the edge of ruin. Its wealth was less, its armies fewer, its enemies greater. And those enemies were no longer content to raid and retreat. They came now as whole peoples, seeking not plunder but new homes within Rome's borders. In the West, Rome itself began to tremble. In 410, Alaric and his Visigoths marched upon the Eternal City. For centuries, Rome had stood untouchable, the heart of empire, the symbol of its power. Now, its walls were breached, its streets pillaged, its citizens terrified. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves across the world. To the Romans, it seemed as though the end of all things had come, the gods, or perhaps the god, abandoning the city that had once ruled them all. The East, meanwhile, endured. Constantinople's massive walls and strategic wealth shielded it from the fate of its western twin. The city became not only a political capital but a spiritual one, where emperors ruled beside patriarchs, and where Greek culture fused with Roman law and Christian faith to form a new identity. While the West faltered, the East thrived, holding the empire's legacy for centuries to come. But the decline of the West could not be halted. Vandals crossed into Africa, seizing the empire's richest province and cutting off the grain supply that had fed Rome for generations. In Gaul and Spain, new kingdoms rose upon the ruins of Roman order. The Huns, fierce horsemen from the steppes, thundered into Europe under their leader Attila, striking terror wherever they rode. Rome, once the master of all, now begged allies for survival, hiring barbarian tribes as mercenaries to defend what remained of its frontiers. And yet, even in these desperate times, Rome's spirit endured. Its laws, its roads, its language, its vision of order and civilization carried on in the hearts of its people. The empire had divided, weakened, and stumbled, but it had not yet fallen. The final act was still to come, an act that would end the Western Empire but ensure that the echoes of Rome would never truly fade. The Empire of the West had weathered centuries of storms, but by the 5th century its walls no longer stood against the rising tide. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 had shaken the world, but it was only the beginning. The Visigoths, having plundered the Eternal City, did not vanish back into the shadows. They moved into Gaul and Spain, carving out new kingdoms upon the soil that had once been bound by Roman law. The Vandals, fierce and relentless, swept across Gaul into Spain and finally crossed into North Africa, seizing Carthage in 439. With that conquest, Rome lost not only a vital province but the breadbasket that had sustained its people for generations. The empire's strength had become its weakness. Its vast borders could no longer be defended, its legions too few, its treasury too empty. To hold back the flood, emperors increasingly relied on alliances with the very barbarians who pressed upon them. Foederati, they were called, foreign tribes settled within Roman lands in exchange for military service. But their loyalty was never certain. They fought for gold, for land, and for their own survival, not for Rome's glory. The East looked on with a mixture of pity and calculation. Constantinople, protected by its walls and its wealth, endured the assaults that shattered the West. Emperors there sometimes sent aid, but their priority was their own survival, their own empire. The unity of Rome was gone, the West stood largely alone. Yet there were moments when it seemed Rome might still endure. In the mid-5th century, as terror spread across Europe, a new threat emerged from the steppes, the Huns, led by Attila. His riders swept across the land like a storm, leaving ruin in their wake. No city seemed safe, no army able to stand against them. In 451, the fate of the West hung in the balance at the Catalonian plains. There, a coalition of Romans and Visigoths, desperate allies bound by necessity, met Attila in battle. The clash was fierce, the outcome uncertain, but at last the Huns were checked. The Western Empire had survived another day, though only just. Attila returned the following year, pressing into Italy itself, but here he found resistance not only in arms but in spirit. Legend tells that Pope Leo I himself rode out to meet the scourge of God, persuading him to withdraw. Whether by diplomacy, famine, or disease, Attila turned back. Soon after, he died, and with his death, the Hun Empire collapsed as swiftly as it had risen. Rome had outlasted even Attila, but the cost of survival was heavy. Its strength was drained, its provinces gone, its people weary. The Vandals, secure in North Africa, turned pirate upon the seas. In 455, they struck Rome itself. Once again, the Eternal City was at the mercy of invaders. For 2 weeks, the Vandals stripped it of treasures, carrying away what centuries had built. Unlike Alaric's sack, This time there was little illusion left. Rome was no longer the mistress of the world, but a jewel waiting to be taken. As the empire staggered, its emperors became shadows. Few ruled more than a handful of years. Many were puppets of powerful generals or barbarian warlords. The Senate, once the proud guardian of Rome's destiny, had become a hollow formality. Real power lay in the hands of military strongmen, often of barbarian descent themselves, who commanded the loyalty of the troops. One such man was Ricimer, who made and unmade emperors at will, ruling the West through others until his death. By the late 5th century, the Western Empire had shrunk to little more than Italy and fragments of Gaul. Spain, Africa, Britain, all were gone. The Visigoths, Vandals, Burgundians, and others had carved up its former lands into kingdoms of their own. The Roman dream of universal empire was dead. The reality was a patchwork of successor states. And then came the end. In 476, a boy named Romulus Augustulus wore the crown of the Western Empire. His name was a cruel echo of the past: Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, and Augustus, the first emperor. Yet this Romulus was no founder, no Augustus. He was a child placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes. The real power lay with Orestes, but even he could not command the loyalty of his barbarian troops. Among those troops was a Germanic leader named Odoacer. When Orestes refused to grant them the lands they demanded, they turned upon him. Orestes was slain, and Odoacer marched upon Ravenna, the imperial capital. Romulus was spared his life, but his crown was taken. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor in the east was enough. The Western Roman Empire, which had stood for centuries, was no more. Thus, in 476, the Western Empire came to its end. To some, it passed almost quietly. There was no great battle, no final defense of Rome's walls. Instead, it slipped away with a boy's crown handed to a barbarian king. Yet the weight of that moment echoed across the centuries. The city that had once ruled the world was now just another possession in the hands of foreign rulers. But the fall of the West was not the fall of Rome itself. In the East, Constantinople endured. Its emperors still called themselves Romans, its laws still echoed those of the old republic, its language shifted to Greek, but its identity remained tied to the empire that had once stretched across continents. The Byzantines, as we call them now, saw themselves as Romans, and in many ways they were. The empire lived on, though in a new form, for 1,000 years more. For the peoples of the West, the fall of Rome was both an ending and a beginning. The vacuum left by its collapse gave rise to new kingdoms, new cultures, new identities. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, all built upon the ruins of empire. The Church, too, rose in prominence, filling the void of authority. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became a central figure, guiding the faithful in a world where emperors no longer reigned. The Western Roman Empire was gone, but its legacy was not. The roads still stretched across Europe, the aqueducts still carried water, the laws still shaped justice, the Latin tongue still lingered on the lips of the people. Rome had fallen, but Rome also endured, its echoes resonating through the Middle Ages and beyond. And so the story of the empire turned a page. The fall of the West marked the close of one age, but not the end of Rome. The eternal city, humbled, would rise again in new forms, its spirit carried forward by kings, by emperors, by the church, and by the memory of what had been. The story of Rome did not end in 476, it transformed, becoming the foundation upon which Europe itself would be built. Though the Western Empire had fallen in 476, Rome itself did not vanish. The city stood, scarred and humbled, yet still alive. Its marble temples might have crumbled, its emperors disappeared, but the spirit of Rome lingered, carried not only by the stones of its streets but by the memory of its greatness. The Eastern Empire in Constantinople continued to flourish, claiming to be the true heir of the Caesars, while in the West, new kingdoms rose where Roman provinces had once stretched. But even as the political empire died, Rome's legacy endured in ways deeper and more lasting than crowns and armies. The first and most enduring of these legacies was law. Roman law had developed over centuries, blending custom, decree, and reason into a system that sought not only to punish but to define justice. It organized contracts, property, rights, and responsibilities with a clarity unknown to most ancient peoples. Even after the Western Empire fell, these laws were preserved, copied, and studied. Centuries later, they would form the backbone of European legal systems, shaping the way nations governed themselves. The idea that law could be written, debated, and applied to all was Rome's gift to the world. Just as powerful was Rome's legacy in language. Latin, the tongue of the legions and the Senate, did not vanish when the empire collapsed. It evolved, mingling with the dialects of conquered peoples, giving birth to new languages: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. These Romance languages carried within them the echo of Rome's speech. Latin also endured as the language of the Church, of scholarship, and of learning for more than 1,000 years after the fall, ensuring that the voice of Rome whispered in the classrooms and cathedrals of medieval Europe. Architecture and engineering too bore witness to Rome's genius. The aqueducts, built to carry water across valleys and hills, remained standing, some still functioning long after their builders were gone. The great roads stretched across continents, so well built that many would be used into the modern age. The arches, domes, and amphitheaters of Rome inspired architects for centuries. When men of the Renaissance raised cathedrals and palaces, they looked to the ruins of Rome for guidance. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the triumphal arches, all became symbols of human ambition and creativity, reminders that stone, when shaped with vision, could outlast empires. And there was the Church. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had become the heart of the empire under Constantine and Theodosius. When emperors no longer ruled in the West, the Church remained. The Bishop of Rome, called the Pope, rose as a figure of authority, guiding not armies but souls. In the chaos of barbarian invasions and fractured kingdoms, the Church offered continuity, order, and hope. It preserved knowledge, copied manuscripts, and kept alive the memory of Rome's order in a world that seemed to crumble into darkness. In many ways, the Church became Rome reborn, wielding spiritual authority where political authority had failed. The idea of Rome as an empire also never truly died. Kings and rulers across Europe dreamed of reviving its glory. In 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope, reviving in name what had long since fallen in reality. The Holy Roman Empire that followed, though never Rome in truth, carried the title for centuries. In the East, the Byzantines proudly called themselves Romans, and even when their empire fell in 1453, the Ottoman sultans who conquered Constantinople styled themselves as heirs to Rome. To be Roman was to claim a lineage of power, civilization, and majesty that no one could ignore. Rome's cultural legacy was just as profound. Its literature, from the epics of Virgil to the histories of Livy and Tacitus, continued to be read, studied, and imitated. Its philosophy, shaped by Stoics and statesmen alike, offered guidance on virtue, duty, and reason. Cicero's eloquence inspired generations of orators and politicians, while the Roman sense of duty to the state influenced ideas of citizenship that would resurface in later democracies. Even in decline, Rome had given the world a treasury of thought and art that would never be lost. And perhaps most enduring of all was Rome's idea of itself, the belief that civilization could be ordered, that roads could connect peoples, that law could bind nations, that power could be centralized and yet shared. The Republic had fallen to empire, the empire had fallen to kingdoms, but the dream of Rome, the idea of a united and civilized world, never ceased to haunt humanity. When men in later centuries built their nations, they often looked to Rome as their model. The American founders studied the Roman Republic, drawing lessons from its Senate, its checks on power, and even its failures. The architecture of their new capital echoed Roman forms, domes, columns, triumphal designs, as if to say that the spirit of Rome had crossed the ocean. Nations across the world, from Europe to the New World, measured their own glory against the standard Rome had set. The fall of the Western Empire in 476 was an ending, but it was also a transformation. Rome ceased to be a political reality, but it became something greater, an idea, a memory, a foundation upon which new worlds were built. Its echoes could be heard in the languages people spoke, in the laws they obeyed, in the churches they entered, in the roads they traveled, in the books they read, in the very notion of empire itself. Even today, the word, Rome, carries weight. To walk among its ruins is to feel the presence of history pressing close, to sense the ambition and grandeur of those who once ruled the known world. To study its rise and fall is to confront the heights and frailties of human civilization, its capacity for greatness, and its vulnerability to pride, greed, and division. The eternal city was never truly eternal. Its emperors are gone, its legions dissolved, its empire broken. But in another sense, Rome has never died. It lives on in every courthouse built with pillars, in every road that traces a straight line through the countryside, in every language that carries Latin roots, in every law that echoes Roman order, in every dream of unity and greatness. Rome fell, but Rome also endured, its spirit echoing across time, whispering to each new age that dares to build and to rule. And so the story ends where it began, with a city on the Tiber River, founded by legend, that grew into an empire and then into an idea. The boy Romulus gave it a name, Augustus gave it power, Constantine gave it faith. Generations of men and women gave it their labor, their hope, and their lives. Empires may fall, but the echoes of Rome remain, shaping the world we inherit. To speak of civilization, To dream of empire, to seek greatness, all these are to hear still the echoes of history, the voice of Rome that will never be silenced.